You're listening to PROX.
I was fresh out of film school, bro. I was probably close to 200 grand in debt. You know what I mean? You know, trying to make a movie in Oakland. It was nuts, bro.
But it's like that thing, like, and that's kind of how I've always operated, which is almost like a naive audacity.
Yeah.
You know, like not really knowing what I'm getting into.
Totally.
Like I'm just gonna jump because I feel something. I feel something really in my bones. You know.
Yeah.
Today, we have a very special episode. Directors and Proximity co-founders Ryan Coogler and Pete Nix sit down to talk about directing fiction and nonfiction films. They answer some listener questions and share insights on collaborating on Proximity's latest releases, directed by Pete and produced by Ryan and our partners. Stephen Curry, Underrated, a remarkable coming-of-age story about one of the most influential, dynamic, and unexpected players in basketball history. Out now on Apple TV Plus and select theaters. And Anthem, a musical journey across the U.S. experimenting to reimagine the National Anthem. That's streaming now on Hulu. By the way, Pete and Ryan met on Ryan's first feature film, Fruitvale Station, which was released in theaters 10 years ago this month. Their conversation starts there.
I'm Peter Nix. I'm a producer and director of documentary films and one of the co-founders of Proximity Media, and I run our nonfiction division.
I'm Ryan Coogler. I'm one of the founders of Proximity Media, and I'm a writer, director, producer of motion pictures. And I'm here with my good friend, Pete Nix.
Ryan, I was trying to remember how we met. There's some controversy over this because I'm getting old, so I forget stuff.
Yeah, me too, bro. Like, I have a memory of meeting you at a cafe or a restaurant. I know Michelle Turner-Sayeo, who used to run the Kenneth Rainin Foundation for the San Francisco Film Society, was who linked us up. And my memory of meeting you was like across a table with either food or coffee.
My memory is different. my because I just tie it to the waiting room. I just remember we were at a theater, I believe it was the Kabuki in San Francisco.
Yes.
And I mean, this was like my first sort of independent films, and I remember you there.
Yeah, I feel like we met before that.
We did.
I feel like Michelle told me about your movie, and she linked us up. And I think we were linked before I saw your film, I think
you're right.
Yeah.
So The Waiting Room is the first in a trilogy of films, all of which are now streaming on Hulu. The Waiting Room, Home Room, and The Force. I made The Waiting Room because my wife, Vanna, that was, you know, her first job out of grad school as a speech pathologist, was working at Highland Hospital. And, you know, the stories that she brought home about her patient population inspired me to want to tell the story. It's a heavy movie. It's also beautiful. There's a lot of beauty.
Yeah.
There's a lot of beauty in that. And one of my favorite reviews of it said something like, I wish it would never end. You know,
oh, wow. Yeah,
these little anecdotes, these moments of
Yeah.
humanity where you're sort of dipping into these moments where everybody's joined together in this sort of common experience.
Yeah. No, for sure. I remember CJ, the nurse.
Yeah, CJ.
Yeah.
I remember taking her to the audition for Fruitvale.
Yeah. That was crazy, man. Yeah.
She was so nervous.
Man, she was nervous, bro.
I was like, CJ, like, just be yourself. Like,
I couldn't believe how nervous she was, man. I was thinking because she had done it with the documentary camera, she'd be good.
Well, you were blown away by her just being her in a documentary.
Yeah.
And I think you were casting, you needed a cast a nurse.
I needed a nurse at Highland Hospital.
I remember distinctly, I don't remember the exact model, but you had this like kind of like truck.
The car I had?
Yeah.
It was a Ford Explorer.
And you were driving around, and you seemed to me, I was trying to like figure you out. Because you seemed like totally like scattered and like over committed.
That's funny.
And I was like, does this guy like have it together? Has he got control over the situation? I wasn't completely sure. But I remember we were pulling up to Highland and I was talking about a lens or something. And I said something and you corrected me and you were right. And I was thinking, oh, okay, this guy, he's like a little bit of a geek, a nerd, like a gear nerd. And that's when I knew.
Oh,
That's when I knew.
man.
Like, okay, I gotta keep my eye on this
Yeah.
guy.
I think both things were true, bro. I was definitely in over my head on that movie. And especially at that time. Because the reason that we got introduced, Michelle Turner-Sayeo, who was supporting emerging filmmakers out of the Bay Area, her and the program had been very generous with grants for Fruitvale, you know. And I run into a little bit of static trying to get access to Highland Hospital. And then she said, yo, a filmmaker we've supported, who's great, Pete Nix, you need to meet him. He just finished a film about
Right.
Highland. And I was asking away, and I got denied. And I remember, like in a sec, we were sitting in the office of the president of the hospital.
Right, Lassiter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you kind of laid it out for him. Hey, this is what's going on. And then he was like, let me try to get this done for you. All of a sudden, we had the green light to whatever we needed in the hospital. It was fantastic.
You know, it's interesting because, I mean, I was just following my instincts and just trying to, like, you know, make connections. After Wright met you, he was like moved by you. I think he read the script.
Right.
He met you, and he told me, I don't know if I ever told you this, but he said that you reminded him of himself as a young man.
Oh, that's crazy.
He had aspirations, you know, and obviously at that time he was, you know, the head of the CEO of this hospital. Now he's gone on to lead huge hospital systems, and he was moved by, you know, seeing a reflection of himself in you, and I think that had a lot to do with, you know, why he said yes.
That's incredible. The reason it's hard to actually go back and figure out when the time was that we met. For one, it's been a while, but for two, it feels like we got close quick, you know, in a way where things start to blur.
Yeah. Well, I think what happened to me, which is I think what happened to a lot of people, was they saw a spark or something, an authenticity in you. And I remember each person I introduced you to sort of had that same reaction. And, you know, my feeling about it was a little bit like Wright's, which was like, you know, I had a lot of these aspirations when I was younger, but my life was a mess, you know. Took me, you know, a long time to sort of work through a lot of that stuff. But when I was your age, I think you were 26 at the time that we met.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was, you know, not long out of prison. I was just sober, and I was trying to sort of, you know, get my life together. And so I think there's some kind of vicarious thing that was happening there, that I was drawn to your, you know, potential. I was drawn to your, you know, your wit, your creativity. I saw a short film that you did, Locks, which to this day, it's one of the most, I was crying, you know, watching that short, which was you know, about, you know, a brother in solidarity with his younger brother who had cancer, shaving his hair off, you know. But the way that you laid it out and the misdirection and the mood and the setting, it was just beautiful. And I knew at that point, I was like, however I can help this guy, you know, achieve what he's trying to achieve, I'm there.
I appreciate that, man. But I felt the same way when I saw the waiting room. Like, you know, and we connected on a lot of different levels. But I think the big thing for me was just like, you know, I was at a time where I needed a lot of help. Just in general, I think we met, I might have been sharing a room with my baby brother, with Keenan, trying to mount this movie that was the biggest I had ever done at the time. But it also had a lot of pressure on it in terms of representing the Bay Area, representing a person's life, you know, family. And I was definitely, I think you were picking up on me kind of being in over my head, me trying to grasp and get my life together at the same time. But it was actually nice to have something to focus on, you know, and something that could bring me in contact with other people who are actually doing it. You know what I mean? Like, and by doing it, I mean just executing on their vision, you know, executing on getting these ideas that they have made, be it a program to help support independent filmmakers, or having an idea to make a film about the waiting room and at this particularly impactful hospital in Oakland. You know, it kept me going in many ways, man. But I was fresh out of film school, bro. I was probably close to $200,000 in debt. You know what I mean? You know, trying to make a movie in Oakland. It was nuts, bro.
But it's like that thing, like, and that's kind of how I've always operated, which is almost like a naive audacity.
Yeah.
You know, like, not really knowing what I'm getting into.
Totally.
Like I'm just gonna jump because I feel something. I feel
Yeah.
something really in my bones, you know.
Yeah.
And I felt that the first time. I didn't just make the waiting room. You know, Vanna works there, and she's a refugee from Laos, and she would come home with stories about her patient population. And I just immediately understood that there was a story to be told here. Not fully understanding because I'm not, I wasn't born and raised in the Bay, but I've lived here since '97, so now it's my adopted second home. I lived
Probably
here
been here longer than anywhere else.
Yeah. But there was an instant recognition, for me, for my own story, for sort of, raising my kids and sort of what that, the reflection. And I remember when I was at Howard, my roommate, Ed Parks, who's from Bakersfield, we decided to drive out from DC to and I'd never been out to California before. And he's like, we're going to stop through Oakland.
Right.
And I remember feeling like it had this vibe like, ooh, Oakland.
Right.
And it's so interesting to think back to that moment, because my perception of it was, I think, what a lot of people's perception of it, which was, it was the city, it was dangerous, it was like off the grid, it was, stereotyped, misunderstood.
Yeah.
And that always stuck with me. And when I first started getting to know the folks at Highland, not just the staff there, CJ and Wright and everybody, but like the patients, many of whom were, not stereotypical. They were like, white folks who just lost their job. There were, people in bands. There were entrepreneurs. But yeah, there were also drug addicts. There were homeless people, unhoused. There were people who were having a really rough go at it. People had just pissed on themselves. And every conversation I had was a revelation. And that really sparked it. That really sparked it for me. And when I met you, it was like you were coming at it like from a different angle, that I'd never seen before. And that kind of fascinated me because I'd never really done fiction or sort of worked through that process of rendering, an idea or a theme. But the fact that, Oscar was a person, flesh and blood, he was a story, he's somebody that we had all heard about. And I didn't know at the time that he was born
at the hospital.
At Highland. I found that out later. CJ actually told me that.
Wow.
Because she remembered when he was born.
Wow.
And I remember her telling me that, and I was just like blown away by that.
Yeah. No, I didn't know that either. I didn't know that he had been born there. Till his mom told me. When I was interviewing her for research, she shared that, and I was like, oh man, that he was born and ended up passing away in the same place. He wasn't from Oakland, but Oscar was from Hayward, So it was interesting that he was, for him to have been born and pass away in Oakland, I thought it made more sense to shoot the film there.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right. How old was Oscar when he passed away?
We were effectively the same age. He was murdered in the first day of 2009, I believe. So he'd have been like 22 years old. Yeah, 22 years old, if my math is right. And you talk about getting sober when you were 25. Me, you met me when I was 26, just getting a chance to make a film for the first time, feature film for the first time. So for me, it was always something that I thought about a lot. What if somebody took my life when I was 22? How much would I not have had a chance to accomplish? How much would I not have known about what type of person I was going to end up being? And that in many ways motivated me in terms of like finding a theme for the film. This theme of self-discovery, self-determination. The whole film, he's trying to figure out what kind of guy he's going to be. And that's something that the film kind of taught me. That idea that every day you kind of get an opportunity to choose what type of person you're going to be today.
How did you know how, in terms of communicating that theme or that feeling that you wanted the audience to have, or how you wanted the audience to relate to Oscar, to his family?
Yeah.
Like, it being your first film, like, how do you know it's going to work? Like, or how do you know?
You don't, man. Yeah, you don't. You never know. Each time I make something, I don't know if it's going to work, I got more confidence in your movies than I got on my own. Like when you say, hey, I'm gonna make Anthem, I'm like, oh yeah, this is gonna be great. Peace got it. You know what I'm saying? Like, or underrated. But like for myself, I'm usually pretty unsure,
Because you're relying not just on your words, like the script, you're relying on actors, you're relying on a cinematographer, you're
a lot of variables.
On,
Yeah. It was things where it was so many unknowns in terms of just my cast and crew. What I try to do is like focus on what I do know. And like what my strengths are focus on that, and then focus on the weaknesses. Like put the energy on those things. And what I knew with Fruitvale was that I knew I wanted it to be a one-day movie. It's a long history of one-day movies being really good, really effective. So I knew that, and the more research I did, the more it made sense, because there was a lot of irony in that day, in the truth of it. So I was sticking to that. So what I did was I found every one-day movie that I could find that was good, and I tried to find the common themes that they did in those movies.
That seems like an obvious thing, but that was one of the first things actually that you taught me, or that I realized that you really focused on was comps, like movies, like
comps,
movies that like what's in the zone of this.
Yeah, the comp thing is helpful for studio speak. It's helpful for people who don't process film language like a filmmaker. Their relationship with the language is audience. Comps are very helpful for those type of people. Like you say, oh, it's this mixed with that, mixed with this, and they get it better than they would if you gave them a deck. You know what I'm saying? I try to find comps for the making side of it. You know what I mean? Like for the structural side of it. You'll find that with all makers, right? People who make clothes, they looking at, what clothes work that inspire them. What are they trying to do? Chefs, right? It's a great episode of The Bear. I don't know, it's been in the second season. But I mean, it's not a spoiler, bro.
It's okay.
Like it's an episode where the chefs, they gotta go eat food all over the place just to
yeah, it's like Anthem, like
the process of making something. You know what I mean? You gotta be. It's not enough to just be an expert in the craft overall. You gotta kind of like make yourself an expert in the exact thing that you're doing.
There's something extra. I love to cook, but I'm a terrible cook. I mess stuff up. Like the first 2 or 3 times me cooking something,
you gotta make kind of bad
disaster.
Pancakes. Yeah.
Yeah. And like with a movie, there's a lot more at stake. I guess you could mess it up, but like...
Yeah, but this ain't your first movie though. Like, you know what I'm saying? You several movies in. The first things you ever tried to make were probably bad. That's just been my experience,
It gets philosophical, like what's your first film, because you kind of tell stories.
Yeah.
To yourself and in different ways, right? I think that's how kind of you got launched on your career. I think you were... Was it at St. Mary's, or you were in a class, or you were writing something, and one of your professors was like, "Hey,
I had a credit writing assignment." Yeah, and
this is not bad.
Yeah, she was like, "Yo, you should write screenplays." From some prose that I wrote. But what's crazy, Pete, is like I tell that story because it's the truth. But I got homies I grew up with who had to remind me that whenever we would have like a class assignment, I would try to do a movie for it. I forgot about this. This would be like 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. You know what I'm saying? I didn't own a camera. It was my boy who had a camera who had to tell me, hey, you would always partner up with me. We would make a movie. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, oh yeah, I did used to do that. You know what I'm saying?
It just didn't click.
Yeah, no,
you were already on your journey.
Bro, I'd forgotten about it. You know what I mean? Like honestly.
Yeah. Same thing with me. I forgot. It was when I made my first technical film, The Wolf, my autobiography.
Yeah.
I had all this footage of me when I was 12,
right?
Of me doing the Pete Nick show at my family reunion, interviewing like all my family members. I was like, oh shit.
See?
That's where it began.
Jumping ahead, it's basically like 11 years after we met, and you were talking about opening the waiting room, which I know had a theatrical release and played at some major festivals. But we sitting here right now, having been running a company for some years now, and this is a year where you releasing 2 movies that you directed back to back. Anthem, which is on Hulu now, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival a few weeks back, and it's out now. Anyone who has access to Hulu, who has a Hulu subscription, can watch the film. I'm getting text messages from people who watching it at different times and being moved by it. And we also are a few weeks removed from what I think will be our biggest release on something that we worked together, which is underrated, the Stephen Curry story. That is coming out on Apple Television Plus, as well as a limited theatrical release. about the best shooter that ever played a game of basketball. What's it like, man? Like having that breadth of styles of work, in such a limited time.
I'm learning, It's funny. We first started working together actually on The Force when I was making the second film in my trilogy, because again, going back to my kind of naive audacity, like just jumping into stuff I maybe didn't have any business doing. You were one of the first people I called, and I was like, hey man, I'm thinking about doing this film. Well, I wasn't thinking, I had already gotten access.
Yeah. And
I think I called you up, and you gave me a very sobering kind of insight into your feelings about the police, your relationship with the OPD, and you were worried about me. And that really began our sort of collaborative, because I was paying very close attention to what you were saying, whether you know it or not. A lot of that found its way into the movie.
Right.
It was a very difficult thing that I was trying to do, which was step into a police department without, an agenda, without passing judgment, and just sort of try to document this department trying to change.
Right.
And I'll never forget, you said the police department's functioning just the way it's supposed to. That the problems that are inherent in the police are built into the history of going back to slave patrols.
Yeah.
And that always stuck with me, and that really, that carried over obviously into Homeroom when I decided to sort of, I always knew education was going to be the third piece in the trilogy.
Right. I
think this was before you approached me about sort of proximity, but I wanted you to be involved in some way, and then that sort of just sort of dovetailed. But it was like this notion of when you're an independent, especially a documentary filmmaker, and you definitely experience this too with Fruitvale. You're just scraping for every little buck you can get.
Totally.
Trying to raise money, trying to hustle. Nobody really knows who you are.
Yeah.
The notion of having, support is powerful. And at the time, flash forward to when Homeroom was coming out, you had made, Creed, you had made Black Panther.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of sort of collaborating alongside you gave me a ton of energy, gave me a lot of energy, but also the recognition that what we were doing wasn't so different.
No.
In terms of the themes that we explored in our work and the stage from which we told our stories from in the Bay, and how those found its way into the characters and the ideas just felt natural to me. So I was just, grateful. And obviously when we met and you'd approached me about proximity, we had lost my daughter, Karina, who you knew really well. And, I don't think I would have said yes to anyone else who would come calling from Hollywood. No offense to Hollywood. That was a big reason, why, that felt comfortable for me. When I'm going through a difficult time in my life, I turn to sort of the things that energize me, and storytelling, filmmaking.
Right.
Is one of those things where I'm going to be learning for the rest of my life.
Right. I kind of agree with you more in terms of how much our work had in common, man. Like that was never lost on me. In that wedding room, I remember seeing this in the film. You enabled them to claim their humanity just by being honest with the camera, being honest with you. And for me, that was what it was always about: proclaiming humanity for people who are often denied it. Very often through media, they're denied it, stripped of it. You did it again with the trilogy. Each time you're looking at these things, and it might be stories that you would dismiss or write off through the language of cinema. Often cinema verite, you invite the audience, let's look a little deeper at this. Let's look a little deeper at this system. Let's look a little deeper at these next generation. You know what I mean? And everybody's ready to write off.
Mm-hmm. It's so weird, like the coincidences, but The Wire, love it or hate it or ambivalent, it had an influence on me in terms of looking at an American city.
How could it not?
And sort of how all these systems were connected. I remember the first one of the first people that I met at Highland was a young girl. She had been shot outside of Edna Brewer when she was 12, and she wasn't in school, getting her education and dreaming big. She was stuck in the waiting room at Highland Hospital getting treatment for a gunshot wound, and that's when I began thinking about sort of the connections, between the agency of a young person, the agency of a community, and how the systems connect to that, whether it's the healthcare system, access to healthcare, criminal justice system, education system, and how that trilogy unfolded in ways that were surprising. Homeroom wasn't supposed to be about a group of kids removing police from their schools to reallocate the money, to basically defund the police. It was supposed to be a film about the emotional lives of young kids of color, like my kids. And I grew up watching The Breakfast Club and Pretty in Pink and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. These were my favorite movies growing up.
Right.
These were all white kids in the suburbs.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I wanted to sort of step into that space in Oakland. And what happened. You know, like the pandemic broke out. You know, we lost Karina. There was so much loss that was happening. And in the wake of that, these kids found their voice. And I could not help but think about sort of Oscar and think about what, you know, what these kids are doing represents what was lost.
Yes.
You know, and that's why we tell these stories. And
Yes.
so that sort of connection was really profound.
Yes.
I think now I'm evolving, you know, and I still have a strain of my intention. I want to go hang out, you know, and with people who might be quote unquote vulnerable.
Right.
But, you know, I think we have an opportunity to sort of expand sort of the notions of storytelling. And you think about Steph Curry, and I remember when you first came to me about this idea,
Yeah.
it was I had to pause on it, to be honest, because it's like celebrity, this is the exact opposite of the work that I've been doing.
Yeah.
You know, this guy's anything but vulnerable.
Yeah.
But there was something about, the more I thought about his story, the more I thought about his connection to the Bay, and, you know, the more I learned about sort of, you know, even though he was the son of Del Curry, he grew up privileged kid, he faced a lot of doubt, people sort of not believing that he could do it, people not really validating him, and he had to find a way of pushing beyond that. And that sort of clicked for me, that, man, there's a way that we can tell these stories in a big way. They're going to engage audiences.
Yeah.
I call it the Trojan horse, and I think you did this brilliantly with Black Panther, because I tell the story more than once. I've told this story when I was in Utah, when Karina was in treatment in Utah. We saw Black Panther in a theater full of white Mormons watching Black Panther. And to me, that was like, talk about, you know, subversive.
Yeah.
That's powerful. Trojan horse. And even, you know, what you do with Creed and perspective, reimagining the Rocky franchise, which I think, you know, Stallone was ready to shut that down, and you reimagined it and you pitched your perspective. So that's really powerful. And that I think what I'm hoping to do with our nonfiction slate is to sort of take that spirit and that ethos and you know, get as many people as we can sort of engaging these ideas, and, you know, maybe sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly.
But it's always bold ideas, Pete, and the ideas always contrast in an interesting way. It's there in the trilogy that's set here in Oakland, but it's also there in Anthem, and it's there in Underrated. Just inside of Steph, his story is all this contrast. You know, it's all of this unknown things that you got to kind of look closer at. That idea of self-doubt and the voice that's in your head. That idea of, because that film Underrated is about Steph, but it's really, I think it's like an intergenerational love story. You know what I'm saying? Like it's him and his coach, him and his college coach, who in that film is a person who believes in him and doesn't have any reason to no ulterior motives. You know what I'm saying? Like, just, I believe you can be a great basketball player for this team. You know, I believe we can help each other. And that was all that guy needed, it seemed. You know what I'm saying? Like at the point that he was at.
He saw himself, you know. It's the same thing with Wright Lassiter when he met you at Highland, and he saw, you know, a younger version of himself. He wanted to help you, and, you know, Coach McKillop, very similar story. Like, he was a undersized, scrappy player. Had to fight. Had to, you know, take what's yours. You know, when you're the underdog, you have to take what's yours. And that mentality. And so when he saw Steph, he recognized it, and that's exactly right, like the way you describe it, like this intergenerational or this sort of different aspects of family or mentorship.
Totally.
And the Davidson community itself is part of that story as a reflection to some degree of the Bay. How the Bay is kind of misunderstood, underrepresented.
Totally.
All those themes were strong, came through very strong.
Yeah, that underrated. You know, and that question about how can this dude, you know, who's got all these championships, all of these accolades, and came from this family, how can he be underrated? And the film answers the question. You know, I'm proud to be a part of it. You know, I can't wait for people to see it and be moved by it. And I'm glad it's getting a theatrical release too, because we saw it at Sundance, man. It's a movie for a crowd.
Oh, it's
you know,
fun.
Like
it's fun with the crowd. It's fun with the crowd.
It's great.
And I love it because I feel like I'm underrated, man. Documentary filmmakers for years. I've been telling people documentaries, they're under marketed. There's an audience for them. People love them.
Yeah.
But we're always scraping, trying to get every little bit of attention, every little dollar of marketing dollar. So I actually, deeply related to that on a personal level. But I also knew that, this was a universal idea that many of us at some point in our lives have had that moment where we've been misunderstood or whatever. And also, for those of us who have achieved great things, that you can usually find someone in your life that's not a parent, like a teacher, coach, a mentor, somebody who's made that difference.
It's been several for me. We talked about it, like, with my professor, Rosemary Graham from St. Mary's College, and it was there with Forrest Whitaker. Me and Nina Yang Bon Jovi with our production company take the chance on you in this story. It was there with you. We could have met, whether it was at the screening or whether it was getting coffee. We could have met and you could have said, good luck, kid. But you didn't. You said, I want to help you. Let me help get you access. Let me get you, what you may need. And something that we glossing over, the ending of the film that we shot after we were accepted at Sundance was shot at the Fruitvale Station, at the event that they do every year, in Oscar's memory. And I wanted to capture it, to end the film like on an update. And you, Paulo, and Karina, y'all came out, boom pause.
I think that was
equipment.
The first time I met producer Sev.
Yeah, that was the first time you met Sev.
Yeah, he's like, Pete. And it was like total Sev. He's like, we're gonna shoot. Can you get that? Can you? Like, absolutely, man.
But I loved, this is before Zinzi and I were married, before we were parents. I love how you pull up in the car with your kids, bro, and was like, "Yo, this my boom pop right here. This my gaffer." You know what I mean? And I was like, "Yo, I love this dude, man." Like, what you don't know is I'm looking around trying to figure out like what my life is gonna look like in 5 years, 10 years, in this crazy job. I'm asking myself, "Yo, can I have a family and do this?" You know what I'm saying? And here you are pulling up, and your kids bounce out with you. They holding the equipment. You like, "Hey, yo," I'm like, "Oh yeah, this." I'm like, "Yo, I could do this," you know what I mean? Like, it was great. And yeah, we shot it, man. We got some really moving material. And that made a lot of sense for the film, made the film better. And that was kind of our first time really working together. That was my first time kind of seeing you in the field in action. You're right there at the bar station.
Special. I remember that.
Yeah, but it was great, man. Yeah, I think people really in for a treat with these movies, man. Both Anthem, man, and Underrated. So by the time this episode comes out, Underrated will be out on Apple TV Plus. And possibly in theater near you in its limited release.
I can't wait. It is kind of a pinch me thing for me to have this stage, to have your inspiration, the company, the people that also believe in our company, what we're trying to do, who are being incredibly supportive, the importance of the notion of what we're trying to do, which goes back to that perspective.
Right.
We talk about not just proximity to often overlooked subjects, which is part of what we talk about.
Yeah.
The perspective is really important because you can tell the same story. You could put an orange on a pedestal and give 3 filmmakers a camera, tell them to make a film about that orange, and you're going to get 3 different films.
100%.
They're going to be meaningful in different ways. And I think that's part of the power of what you're trying to build here. And so I'm just grateful to add my piece.
Man, we lucky to have you, bro. Okay, so at this point in the episode, I'm going to play some questions from some listeners out there, and I believe they are about directing, which me and Pete do often. Yeah, probably too much.
I'm curious. I want to hear these questions.
We're going to try to answer them. So the first clip is from Dorsey.
My name is Dorsey Richmond. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I'm 19 years old. And my question is basically, how do you deal with criticism and dealing with being a perfectionist if you are? Because I think it's easy for people to say, like, who cares what people think? Don't worry about that. And just stuff like that. So I'm curious, as a person, do you take deliberate actions on blocking out the noise? Or like, what do you do personally or tell yourself?
Boy, Dorsey came right into my world because I've just released a film. I think that anytime you put your heart and soul out there, it's an opportunity for growth, is what I say. Because somebody's going to have an opinion about that. That opinion may not be what you want to hear. It may be the very thing that you want to hear. But Vana, my wife, is the first person I go to whenever I release a movie, and I've seen like a review that I don't like, or that plants that seed of doubt. Did I fuck this up? Like, did I just spend the last 3 years of my life, and she brings me back to the perspective of the intention of what you've done, and also a reminder that art is going to move and reflect and bounce off of people in different ways based on their own life experience, based on where they've been.
Yes.
And you cannot control that. For me, it's always an opportunity to be mindful and remember why I embarked on the endeavor, and that, just releasing a movie is not the end.
No.
I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and said, I became a doctor because I saw The Waiting Room. I became a cop because I saw The Force and I wanted to, try to make a difference. I became a teacher because I saw Homeroom. And to me, that's what it's all about.
I think that's a brilliant question. There's no one set answer. I think that to be a professional maker of things, you have to be comfortable putting your stuff out there, knowing that somebody's going to say things about it that can hurt your feelings. It's a natural part of the process. And there's not one thing that's been made that everybody loves. One thing can't be for everybody, right? I try to make things that have universal themes and that can work for as many people as I'm trying to reach. You know what I'm saying? And I like things that are going to be consumed by the masses. Those are the things that used to reach me when I was coming up. When you make something that's for the masses, you got to be ready to get a lot of opinions. There's people out there whose job it is to give opinions. And a lot of times when somebody like that comes down on what you're doing in a way that you maybe don't agree with, it can affect you. But that said, ruminating on people's negative comments about your stuff is unhealthy for you. You got to find a way to step away and protect your own mental space, your own health, so that you can continue to do work that's honest, so you continue to live a healthy life. But up until release, criticism is, I think, really helpful. And it can be helpful after release as well. But I think that going and finding people who can give you that honest opinion about your work, that can be incredibly valuable. And I think Pete's right, about intention. You got to always remember to keep in mind what your intention is. What are you trying to do? Like, who are you trying to reach with this film? What are you trying to say? And I think as long as you're bearing all those things in mind, I think you can move with some purpose.
All right. Our next clip is from Harlem.
My name is Harlan Banks. I'm from the Bay Area. I grew up on Stanford's campus. I'm a freshman at NYU in the film and television production program. And I was wondering how you balance between like creative output and creative input, because I'm trying to do a lot of writing and make short films and get a lot of work done. But at the same time, I want to keep my well full, and I want to read a lot. And so I was just wondering how to balance between like writing and making things and reading.
Oh, man. Input is so important. Before I shoot a documentary, I don't just start rolling the camera. The Waiting Room, I spent months just hanging out and talking to people without shooting anything.
Right.
And that input was so vital to me, sort of building a cultural competency, building a familiarity, building trust. It made the movie better. If you're going to be making movies, I think you need to be watching a lot of movies and find out what turns you on. Like, what it's going to give you ideas, and you're gonna copy some of those ideas. You're going to make some of those ideas your own. You're going to innovate. So that input is so important.
Yeah, it sounds like you in school right now, Harlem. But I'll tell you, man, now is the time to just like spend every waking hour. You should either be sleep, reading, watching, or making. Making includes being on set and writing. Because I can tell you, as a man approaching 40, it don't get easier. You'll get other commitments, you know what I mean? Spouse, children, responsibilities, your windows will shorten. So I think right now is a time where you just, be almost religious about it. I remember when I was in film school, man, I spent all my money at the ArcLight Hollywood. I was watching whatever had just come out. If I liked it, I was watching it twice, 3 times, 4 times, trying to get to the bottom of why I liked it. If you're hoping to produce art for an audience, you kind of got to stay up on what the audience is taking in so that you can have a shot at speaking the language that's current.
And diversify. Don't just like absorb the obvious thing. Really try to force yourself to open your input. You want to be a filmmaker, don't just watch films.
Nah.
expose yourself. If you're mindful, your goal is to become a filmmaker. All of those experiences are going to sort of, be in sort of your subconscious.
The other thing I love to do, and I miss doing this, man, with the pandemic, I always like to just kind of go sit and just listen to people talk. We call it ear hustling where I'm from, but just listen to how people talk to each other. One of my favorite things is like, in New York, it's great for this, like the randomized conversations. Like when you just catch a snippet of what somebody's saying when they're walking by. Sometimes it's so interesting. You know what I mean?
That happens to me all the time. And I'm saying, oh, that would be a great piece of dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Prox Recs.
Prox Recs segment, I'm going to recommend a movie called Hearts of Darkness, a behind-the-scenes film about the making of Apocalypse Now, directed by Eleanor Coppola. She's just documenting the process that Francis was going through, trying to write and direct Apocalypse Now. It's a beautiful film. And I always like watching it because as a filmmaker, maybe never be as good as Francis Coppola, you know what I'm saying? But you've seen him just really, really struggle. It's a reminder of how hard it is. But also, like, the film that they made is pretty fantastic.
I'm a cinema verite guy. I love cinema verite. There's a film that I often talk about, which is the one that got me. Hoop Dreams is the one I usually talk about, but today I'm going in a different direction, and we're going to go Paris is Burning. This is a 1990 documentary directed by Jenny Livingston. It was about a community that was often overlooked. It's a very proximity kind of idea. Beautiful rendering of humanity, surprising, intimate, in there, authentic, and I recommend, if you haven't seen it, definitely go check that out.
Thank you, Pete, for joining this episode. Thanks, Paula, for setting it up, and thank you all for listening. It's Ryan Coogler signing off.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for inspiring me and helping me grow and leading the way.
In Proximity is a production of Proximity Media. If you like the show, be sure to follow, rate, and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And tell your friends and loved ones to do the same. Go on, send a link to someone who you think might really like this conversation. And be sure to watch Stephen Curry Underrated on Apple TV Plus or select theaters, and stream Anthem on Hulu. Learn more and read transcripts of this episode and others at proximitymedia.com. Don't forget to follow @Proximity Media on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. The show is produced by me, Paula Mardo. Executive producers are Ryan Coogler, Zinzi Coogler, Sevo Hanyan, and me. Our theme song and additional music is composed by Ludwig Göransson. Ken Nana is our sound designer and mix engineer. Audio editing for this episode is by Judy Bell Kamangyan, with production assistance from Courtney Archard. Artwork and social media by Alexandria Santana. Special thanks to the whole Proximity Media team, and to you for listening to In Proximity.
Chefs, right? It's a great episode of The Bear. I don't know, like in the second.
Which episode?
I don't know what number it is, but in the second season.
I'm not in the second season yet, so we're gonna stop talking right now.
You gotta get that. You gotta get that done, bro.
I'll get back to you with that.
You gotta get that done.
I know, man.